I never have to worry about a hotel room again. Will I have to pay for it? I never have to worry about that menu. Yeah.
David Lee Edwards hit the jackpot, but it turned out to be a ticking time bomb. The $280 million Powerball win catapulted him from prison to penthouses, but the fairy tale quickly unraveled into a cautionary tale.
Winning the lottery can be life-changing, of course, but not always in the ways you might think. Sometimes that money can launch a quick trip to rock bottom.
What followed was a whirlwind of luxury, excess, and eventual ruin.
A Kentucky man who won part of the $280 million lottery jackpot after being laid off from his job has died.
The millions evaporated as fast as they arrived, leaving Edwards with shattered dreams and a haunting legacy. Join us as we unravel the tragic twists of Edwards' life and explore where his daughter's journey has led her.
Grab those tickets, let's go.
Early life and struggles. David Lee Edwards was born in 1955. Growing up in Ashland, Kentucky, in a household burdened by poverty, his life was marked by sorrow from the very beginning. The first blow came when his elder sister passed away during open-heart surgery. The grief from this loss settled deeply into the Edwards family, leaving a scar that would never fully heal. But the tragedies didn't stop there. As if fate had singled them out for suffering, the family faced another devastating loss when Edwards' elder brother died after a miscalculated dive into the shallow waters of Greenbow Lake. These losses shattered the family, particularly Edwards' mother, who was overwhelmed by the weight of her grief. She was unable to move on, clinging to the remnants of her lost children. Their baby clothes, preserved like relics of a life that might have been, remained hanging in his closet, a constant, painful reminder of what the family had endured. This perpetual state of mourning created a home steeped in sadness, with an atmosphere that weighed heavily on young David. By the time he reached his teens, the cumulative grief and despair became too much to bear. Edwards sought refuge in substances, turning to marijuana and alcohol as a means of escape. The substances offered a temporary numbness, a way to dull the pain that had become a constant companion in his life. But these choices set him on a destructive path, one that would lead to increasingly dangerous behaviors. At just 16 years old, Edwards' life took a darker turn when he was caught committing a robbery, marking his first serious encounter with the law. It was a defining moment, one that set the stage for a lifetime of crime and punishment. The robbery was only the beginning. As Edwards' actions became more reckless, his run-ins with the law grew more severe. One particularly harrowing incident involved a shootout with state police, a desperate act that ended only when authorities resorted to tear gas to subdue him. This event underscored the volatility that had taken root in his life, a volatility fueled by years of unresolved pain and unchecked anger. Following the shootout, Edwards was sent to a reformatory school, an environment intended to correct his behavior. However, the school did little to address the deep-seated issues that drove his actions. Instead of reforming, Edwards continued to spiral, his life increasingly dominated by substance abuse and criminal activity. The structure of the reformatory provided no real solution, only a temporary pause in his downward trajectory. As he grew older, Edwards' crimes escalated. At the age of 26, he committed an armed robbery, a brazen act that ultimately led to his imprisonment. The sentence handed down was for 10 years, but this was far from the end of his story. Parole violations kept him behind bars for a total of 16 years, a period marked by repeated cycles of hope and disappointment as he struggled to break free from the patterns that had defined his life for so long. Life after prison. David Lee Edwards' life took a dramatic turn while he was behind bars. The years he spent in prison were not wasted. Instead, they became a crucible for change, forging a new path out of the ashes of his troubled past. Edwards, once mired in addiction and crime, made a conscious decision to turn his life around. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was one fueled by a newfound determination to escape the destructive patterns that had defined his earlier years. During his time in prison, Edwards got clean, a monumental achievement for a man whose life had been dominated by narcotics. But sobriety was just the beginning. With a clear mind, he set his sights on education, recognizing that knowledge could be his ticket to a better future. He enrolled in college courses, immersing himself in studies that provided not only intellectual growth, but also a sense of purpose. These courses represented more than just a pursuit of a degree. They were a symbol of his commitment to change, a testament to his desire to build a life far removed from the one that had led him to prison. When Edwards was released in 1997, he stepped into a world that had moved on without him. The freedom he had longed for came with its own set of challenges. Determined to stay on the straight and narrow, Edwards found work in the building trade. It was honest work, a stark contrast to the life of crime he had left behind. But the stability he sought remained elusive. The battle against addiction, though seemingly won in prison, was far from over. Outside the controlled environment of incarceration, the temptations and pressures of life began to weigh on him once more. Edwards's struggle with addiction persisted, threatening to undo the progress he had made. The financial instability that came with his new life only compounded his problems. He faced periods of homelessness, living out of his car as he grappled with the realities of his situation. Despite his efforts, it seemed that the shadows of his past were not so easily shaken. Yet, amid these challenges, there were glimmers of hope. Edwards met Shauna Maddox, a waitress who would become a significant figure in his life. Their connection was strong enough to lead to an engagement, offering Edwards not just a partner, but a sense of belonging that had been missing from his life for so long. Shauna became a beacon of support, helping him navigate the ups and downs of his post-prison life. Another moment of stability came when Edwards inherited his parents' old house, valued at $30,000. It wasn't much by conventional standards, but for Edwards, it was a lifeline. The house provided a sense of permanence, a foundation on which he could rebuild his life. It was more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of his roots, a tangible connection to a family that had been through so much. The lottery win. In 2001, David Lee Edwards found himself at the lowest point of his life, teetering on the edge of financial ruin. His situation was so desperate that he couldn't even afford to pay his water bill, a stark reminder of the struggles he faced after years of trying to rebuild his life post-incarceration. With little to his name and no immediate prospects for relief, Edwards was forced to borrow money from a friend just to buy a meal. He settled on pizza, a humble purchase that would unexpectedly become the turning point in his life. On a whim, he used the remaining cash to buy a few Powerball tickets, an act born out of hope rather than any real expectation of winning. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Edwards. Against astronomical odds, he won the $41 million Powerball jackpot. The sheer enormity of the win was overwhelming. After taxes, Edwards was left with a staggering $27 million. In an instant, his life was transformed.
You got all six numbers! Yes, we won!
From living on the brink of homelessness, he suddenly found himself among the ranks of the wealthy. It was a shift that would challenge anyone, but for Edwards, who had spent much of his life grappling with addiction, crime, and poverty, the sudden influx of wealth presented a unique set of challenges. Recognizing the potential pitfalls of such sudden wealth, Edwards sought the advice of a financial advisor. Together, they devised a plan that seemed foolproof. With $16 million invested in safe bonds and annuities, Edwards would secure a steady income of $85,000 per month in interest for the rest of his life. The plan was designed to ensure financial stability, providing a cushion that would allow Edwards to live comfortably without the fear of squandering his newfound fortune. On paper, it was the perfect strategy, one that promised security and the ability to finally leave his troubled past behind. Edwards' lavish lifestyle. Just a few years earlier, he had been living in near poverty, unable to pay his water bill, and now he found himself suddenly thrust into the world of unimaginable wealth. The initial shock of winning such a fortune was tempered by the grand aspirations Edwards held for his future. On the day he accepted his winnings, Edwards stood next to his fiancée, Shauna Maddox, wearing a suit and with his long hair slicked back into a ponytail. He spoke earnestly to reporters, expressing his desire to use the money wisely, not just for himself, but for his family and future generations. "I want this money to last," Edwards declared. "For me, for my future wife, for my daughter, and future generations." But despite his humble words, what followed was a rapid descent into a life of reckless extravagance. The very day he accepted his winning check, Edwards began making decisions that would ultimately lead to his downfall. He took out a $200,000 bank loan, not for investments or financial planning, but to fund a celebratory trip to Las Vegas. Over the course of 6 days, Edwards burned through the money in a spree of gambling and luxury, setting the tone for how he would manage or mismanage his newfound wealth. When Edwards returned home, he left behind his modest $30,000 house in Kentucky and relocated to Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, where he purchased a $1.6 million mansion. The mansion, nestled in a gated community, was a far cry from the humble beginnings that had shaped his earlier life. But the mansion was just the beginning of Edwards' spending spree. He began acquiring a fleet of expensive vehicles, including a Lamborghini Diablo, a Dodge Viper, and a Chevrolet camper van. He also purchased a $1.9 million Learjet, which he used to fly his daughter Tiffany and her mother from Kentucky to Florida after she expressed a desire to live with him. In a revised settlement, he claimed to have paid his ex-wife $500,000 to allow Tiffany to stay with him. The luxury and extravagance didn't stop there. Edwards splurged on high-end jewelry, spending $78,000 on a gold and diamond wristwatch and $150,000 on a bracelet. His generosity extended to family members as well. He bought a $600,000 home in Palm Springs for a relative and a $250,000 home in West Virginia for Shauna's mother. Soon, Edwards had over $1 million worth of cars sitting in front of his Palm Beach Gardens home, prompting complaints from neighbors who felt he was bringing down the tone of the upscale community. His home began to resemble a car dealership, a symbol of the excess that had come to define his life. From the very start, Edwards was spending money at an unsustainable rate, and his spending only accelerated as time went on. Despite his initial intentions to be prudent, Edwards made a series of ill-advised business investments. He purchased 3 racehorses, started a limousine business, and invested in a fiber optics company. These ventures, which may have seemed like promising opportunities at the time, quickly proved to be financial disasters. Within the first year of winning the lottery, Edwards had squandered $12 million of his fortune, a staggering amount that underscored the rapidity of his financial decline. As Edwards' spending spiraled out of control, the financial stability he had hoped to achieve became increasingly out of reach. The financial advisor he had consulted devised a plan that would have allowed Edwards to live comfortably off the interest from his investments. But this plan was quickly overshadowed by his penchant for extravagance. The safe bonds and annuities that were meant to secure his future were not enough to counterbalance the reckless spending that had taken hold of him. Relationship with Tiffany. Despite the life of luxury he created for himself, his relationship with his daughter, Tiffany, remained at the center of his focus. Unfortunately, the path he took after his win, marred by addiction and reckless spending, ultimately strained this relationship and led to a tragic downfall. When Edwards won the lottery, one of his first actions was to reach out to Tiffany, who had been living with her mother while he served time in prison. Eager to reconnect and provide for her in a way he never could before, he invited Tiffany to join him in his new life of wealth and luxury. Her room in his sprawling mansion was decorated like a princess's dream, complete with walls covered in angel motifs, a 30-foot-high ceiling, a bed with a pink princess canopy, a flat-screen TV, and a computer at her desk. The extravagant gifts didn't stop there. He adorned her with a teardrop diamond ring and enrolled her in a prestigious private school where annual tuition exceeded $16,000. However, the picture-perfect life Edwards tried to create for Tiffany was marred by his resurfacing addiction issues and the volatile relationship he had with his fiancée, Shauna Maddox. Despite his efforts to provide for Tiffany, his personal demons often overshadowed the moments they shared together. As Tiffany later recalled, just before he won the lottery, he'd been poorer than he'd ever been. He'd lost his job, and he didn't even have the utilities turned on in his home, so I couldn't go over there very often. But he would always try to be there for me. He'd come round, he'd bring me clothes, he did his best. With his newfound wealth, Edwards wanted to ensure that Tiffany would have opportunities he never had. He enrolled her in the BAT private school, hoping to give her the best education money could buy. But the transition wasn't easy for Tiffany. She struggled with the strict rules and uniform requirements, eventually rebelling and transferring to Juno Beach Prep, where she stayed for 2 years. Despite her difficulties, Edwards remained committed to instilling values in her. "I remember Dad sitting me down and making me write an apology letter to the school and to a boy I'd hit one time," Tiffany said. "He could be lenient and fun, but he was strict too. He always tried to instill the right way of behaving. He wanted me to be educated in a way that he wasn't." The luxurious lifestyle Edwards created for Tiffany included monthly trips on a private jet to visit her mother, friendships with the pilot, and weekends spent on his yacht. For her 13th birthday, he flew her back to Ashland, Kentucky, and rented out the presidential suite of the Ashland Plaza Hotel for a lavish slumber party with her friends. These gestures, though extravagant, were Edwards' way of showing his love and care for Tiffany, even as his personal life spiraled out of control. Yet, beneath the surface of this glamorous life, Edwards' spending was out of control. He indulged in whims that ranged from the absurd to the impractical. A trip to Cinderella's castle at Disneyland, for example, left him fascinated by the suits of armor and knights' swords he saw there. Unable to resist, he purchased every single one, eventually amassing a collection of more than 200 swords. His spending wasn't limited to material possessions. Edwards also gave away vast sums of money to friends, charities, and even strangers. Tiffany recalled one occasion at a Denny's diner where a trainee waitress mentioned she was caring for her ill mother. When it came time to tip, Edwards handed her a $500 bill, but that wasn't enough for him. As they left, he took a $10,000 stack of cash from the glove compartment and told Tiffany to go back inside and give it to the waitress. "He was always doing things like that," Tiffany said. "He donated $50,000 to the boys' club because he grew up around it and wanted to help boys like him. There's a plaque on the wall of the hospice where he ended up dying because he had donated so much to it they could build a new wing." But these acts of generosity, though well-intentioned, were also part of Edwards' downfall. He was inundated with begging letters and fell prey to numerous dubious business deals, losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in the process. Tiffany reflected on her father's choices with a mix of understanding and sadness. "My dad had a soft heart, and that was his downfall, really," she said. "I know he made his choices, and he was responsible too. But his biggest problem was he tried to help Shauna when he should have tried to help himself." As the years went on, Edwards' life continued to unravel. His addiction worsened, his relationships became more strained, and his fortune dwindled. The mansion, the cars, the jet, and the lavish gifts couldn't mask the reality that Edwards was losing control. Downfall to absolute zero. Both Edwards and Shauna had battled drug addiction before their lottery win. For a time, their relationship was marred by the shadow of addiction, but as their substance abuse worsened, it became the defining feature of their lives. Tiffany, Edwards' daughter, observed the deterioration firsthand. "Within a couple of years, it was clear that Shauna was using more and more," she recalled. "At first, my dad tried to keep his use hidden from me, but later he became more careless." The signs of their escalating addiction were evident in their home. Items began to disappear. Edwards' Rolex, Tiffany's jewelry, Shauna's jewelry. Shauna drove off in her Escalade one day and returned without it. Edwards' Bentley also vanished from its usual spot in front of the house. As their addiction deepened, Edwards became increasingly absent from his daughter's life. "At first, we were still looked after by the nannies and butlers," Tiffany said, "but then they left because they weren't getting paid, and it just went downhill from there." Edwards had struggled with addiction since a car accident in 1988 left him with chronic back pain and a dependency on OxyContin. Shauna, however, seemed to drag him further into the depths of addiction. "Shauna just started acting crazy. It was drugs, that's all," Tiffany explained. "People kept telling my dad he should get rid of her, but he never could." Despite multiple attempts to get Shauna into rehab, her addiction persisted. Edwards confided in Tiffany near the end of his life that his one regret was not leaving Shauna and taking care of himself. The couple was not only hooked on each other, but also on drugs. Edwards' financial situation worsened as he squandered his lottery winnings on extravagant purchases and narcotics-fueled escapades. Among his many ill-advised purchases were rare and expensive cars, such as a rare Chevrolet and a $90,000 Dodge Viper. When the money ran out, these status symbols began to disappear. likely sold to buy more drugs or pay off mounting debts. In 2002, Edwards filed for divorce from Shauna, but the couple soon reconciled. Shauna's mother later intervened, asking the state to place Shauna in involuntary care after numerous failed rehab attempts. In 2004, Edwards himself sought to commit Shauna to a rehab program, fearing her extreme drug use would lead to an accidental overdose. During this tumultuous time, Tiffany began to rebel. She got into trouble, smoked pot, and went joyriding, but her parents were too consumed by their own issues to notice. At night, Tiffany and her younger stepbrother Matt would hide outside to escape the violent fights that erupted between their parents, usually over money for drugs. On one occasion, Shauna stabbed Edwards in the leg with her crack pipe. In September 2005, just 4 years after Edwards' lottery win, police were called to his Palm Beach home. Tiffany, then 15 years old, made the call. "It was the final straw," she revealed. "My dad was in the hospital because of his back. CPS already knew about us because we weren't enrolled in school 3 months after term started, and Shauna was supposed to be taking care of us because all the help had quit." Tiffany overheard Shauna on the phone with drug dealers, inviting them to their home. Terrified, she called a relative in California, who urged her to contact the police. When the authorities arrived, they found cocaine and used syringes in Edwards and Shauna's bedroom. Both were arrested, and Tiffany and Matt were placed in foster care. Tiffany never returned to the house that had once been her dream home. The house was eventually foreclosed on, and Edwards' possessions were auctioned off. By this time, Edwards and Shauna were living in a van, and Edwards was suffering from hepatitis. Despite his promises, Edwards never set aside money for Tiffany's future. She learned this heartbreaking truth from her appointed guardian. In 2005, Edwards was hospitalized in Orlando with an abscess on his spine. Shauna, as his next of kin, authorized the surgery that left him paralyzed. Tiffany returned to nurse her father in a hospice after she graduated from high school and turned 18. Edwards spent his final years in debt and deteriorating health, reflecting on the choices that had led to his downfall. Where is Tiffany now? Edwards' life, once marked by the hope and promise of a massive lottery win, took a harrowing turn that eventually led to his demise. The millions that had once made him the envy of many became the very catalyst for his downfall as he and his wife, Shauna, spiraled deeper into the throes of addiction. Their lifestyle, which once glittered with the symbols of wealth and luxury, crumbled under the weight of their drug habits, legal troubles, and deteriorating health. Edwards' health began to fail him long before his death. Years of hard living, compounded by his drug use and frequent clashes with the law, left him a shell of the man he once was. In his final years, his condition worsened significantly, leading to his placement in a hospice, where he eventually passed away 2013 at the age of just 58. By the time of his death, the vast fortune he had won was entirely depleted, leaving him not only penniless, but also deeply in debt. Tiffany, Edwards' daughter, reflected on her father's life with a mixture of sorrow and acceptance. She acknowledged that her life today, though far from what she had once dreamed of when her father first hit the jackpot, is perhaps exactly what it might have been had he never won at all. Tiffany lives a modest life, only a few miles from where she was born. At 23, she is a stay-at-home mother to 3 young children, Isabella, Bradley, and Alexis, who was born just a day after her father's funeral. Her partner of 6 years, Brandon, and she shares a home with his mother, with hopes of moving into a place of their own. Their means are limited, and they live without many of the luxuries that once seemed so abundant in her father's life. Reflecting on her father's legacy, Tiffany noted the duality of her emotions. In the beginning, it was good. I had a dad. That's all I'd wanted. In the end, I was devastated because I'd lost my dad, and I knew it. Despite the hardships and the heartbreak, Tiffany expresses a certain gratitude for the simplicity of her current life, contrasting it with the turmoil and sadness that came with her father's wealth. By 2009, Tiffany had graduated high school and returned to live with her mother. She had begun a relationship with Brandon, and they were just starting out in life together. But instead of embarking on a fresh beginning, Tiffany found herself thrust into the role of caregiver for her paralyzed father. Edwards had suffered a severe medical setback, which left him paralyzed and in need of constant care, a responsibility that Tiffany took on when no one else could or would. For 2 years, Tiffany and her mother did their best to care for Edwards, but eventually, his condition became too much for them to manage. He spent his final years in a nursing home in Lucasville before being moved to a hospice after a series of strokes further debilitated him. Despite the distance and the pain of their shared past, Tiffany visited her father as often as she could. They didn't talk much about what had happened to their family or the choices that had led them there. When they did speak, Edwards would only say that it had been fun while it lasted, that he had had a wild ride. Edwards' funeral was a quiet affair, attended by only a few close to him, a deliberate choice by Tiffany, who wanted to avoid turning his death into the spectacle that his life had become. They couldn't afford a burial, so Edwards was cremated. His ashes are kept in a simple box in Tiffany's bedroom, adorned with a picture of him because she couldn't afford a proper urn. She recalls taking the box with her to the hospital when she gave birth to her daughter, Alexis. In a moment of profound poignancy, she told the nurse that her father was with her, pointing to the box in the window. It was a gesture that might seem odd to some, but for Tiffany, it was a way to keep her father close, even after he was gone. As Tiffany looks back on her father's life and the impact of his lottery win, she remains convinced that if he had not won, he might still be alive today. The sudden influx of wealth, the temptations it brought, and the lifestyle it enabled were too much for him to handle. Despite the tragic end, Tiffany remembers her father as a good man who made wrong choices, but who always had her best interests at heart. Now, as she surveys her modest life filled with the joys and challenges of raising her children, Tiffany finds a sense of peace. "I know he wanted more for me than this," she says, acknowledging the cluttered front room of her home, filled with toys and the everyday mess of family life. "But I've seen what more does, and I'm happy. Being at home and being a mommy is enough for me." Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more.